11. The shot which misses nothing and kills no one. The assailants' fire continued. Musketry and grape shot alternated, but without committing great ravages, to tell the truth. The top alone of the Corinthian facade suffered. The window on the first floor, and the attic window in the roof, riddled with buckshot and biscaïens, were slowly losing their shape. The combatants who had been posted there had been obliged to withdraw. However, this is according to the tactics of barricades. To fire for a long while, in order to exhaust the insurgents' ammunition, if they commit the mistake of replying. When it is perceived, from the slackening of their fire, that they have no more powder and ball, the assault is made. Enjolras had not fallen into this trap. The barricade did not reply. At every discharge by platoons, Gavroche puffed out his cheek with his tongue, a sign of supreme disdain. "Good for you," said he, "rip up the cloth. We want some lint." Courfeyrac called the grape shot to order for the little effect which it produced, and said to the cannon, "You are growing diffuse, my good fellow. One gets puzzled in battle, as at a ball." It is probable that this silence on the part of the redoubt began to render the besiegers uneasy, and to make them fear some unexpected incident, and that they felt the necessity of getting a clear view behind that heap of paving stones, and of knowing what was going on behind that impassable wall which received blows without retorting. The insurgents suddenly perceived a helmet glittering in the sun on a neighboring roof. A fireman had placed his back against a tall chimney, and seemed to be acting as sentinel. His glance fell directly down into the barricade. "There's an embarrassing watcher," said Enjolras. Jean Valjean had returned Enjolras' rifle, but he had his own gun. Without saying a word, he took aim at the fireman, and, a second later, the helmet, smashed by a bullet, rattled noisily into the street. The terrified soldier made haste to disappear. A second observer took his place. This one was an officer. Jean Valjean, who had reloaded his gun, took aim at the newcomer and sent the officer's casque to join the soldiers. The officer did not persist, and retired speedily. This time the warning was understood. No one made his appearance thereafter on that roof, and the idea of spying on the barricade was abandoned. "Why did you not kill the man?" Bossuet asked Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean made no reply. Chapter 12. Disorder, a partisan of order. Bossuet muttered in Combeferre's ear. "He did not answer my question." "He is a man who does good by gunshots," said Combeferre. Those who have preserved some memory of this already distant epoch know that the National Guard from the suburbs was valiant against insurrections. It was particularly zealous and intrepid in the days of June, 1832. A certain good dram shopkeeper of Pantin des Vertus or La Cunette, whose establishment had been closed by the riots, became leonine at the sight of his deserted dance hall, and got himself killed to preserve the order represented by a tea garden. In that bourgeois and heroic time, in the presence of ideas which had their knights, interests had their paladins. The prosiness of the originators detracted nothing from the bravery of the movement. The diminution of a pile of crowns made bankers sing the Marseillaise. They shed their blood lyrically for the counting house. And they defended the shop, that immense diminutive of the fatherland, with Lacedaemonian enthusiasm. At bottom, we will observe, there was nothing in all this that was not extremely serious. It was social elements entering into strife, while awaiting the day when they should enter into equilibrium. Another sign of the times was the anarchy mingled with governmentalism. The barbarous name of the correct party. People were for order in combination with lack of discipline. The drums suddenly beat capricious calls, at the command of such or such a colonel of the National Guard. Such and such a captain went into action through inspiration. Such and such National Guardsmen fought, for an idea, and on their own account. At critical moments, on days they took counsel less of their leaders than of their instincts. There existed in the army of order, veritable guerrilleros, some of the sword, like Fannicot, others of the pen, like Henry Fonfrede. Civilization, unfortunately, represented at this epoch rather by an aggregation of interests than by a group of principles, was or thought itself, in peril. It set up the cry of alarm. Each, constituting himself a center, defended it, succored it, and protected it with his own head. And the first comer took it upon himself to save society. Zeal sometimes proceeded to extermination. A platoon of the National Guard would constitute itself on its own authority a private council of war, and judge and execute a captured insurgent in 5 minutes. It was an improvisation of this sort that had slain Jean Prouvaire. Fierce lynch law, with which no one party had any right to reproach the rest, for it has been applied by the Republic in America, as well as by the monarchy in Europe. This lynch law was complicated with mistakes. On one day of rioting, a young poet, named Paul-Aimé Garnier, was pursued in the Place Royale, with a bayonet at his loins, and only escaped by taking refuge under the porte-coqueret of No. 6. They shouted, "There's another of those Saint-Simonians!" And they wanted to kill him. Now, he had under his arm a volume of the memoirs of the Duc de Saint-Simon. A National Guard had read the words Saint-Simon on the book, and had shouted, "Death!" On the 6th of June, 1832, a company of the National Guards from the suburbs, commanded by the Captain Fannicot, above mentioned, had itself decimated in the Rue de la Chanvrerie out of caprice and its own good pleasure. This fact, singular though it may seem, was proved at the judicial investigation opened in consequence of the insurrection of 1832. Captain Fannicot, a bold and impatient bourgeois, a sort of condottiere of the order of those whom we have just characterized, a fanatical and intractable governmentalist, could not resist the temptation to fire prematurely, and the ambition of capturing the barricade alone and unaided, that is to say, with his company. Exasperated by the successive apparition of the red flag and the old coat which he took for the black flag, he loudly blamed the generals and chiefs of the corps, who were holding council and did not think that the moment for the decisive assault had arrived, and who were allowing the insurrection to fry in its own fat, to use the celebrated expression of one of them. For his part, he thought the barricade ripe, and as that which is ripe ought to fall, he made the attempt. He commanded men as resolute as himself, raging fellows, as a witness said. His company, the same which had shot Jean Prouvaire the poet, was the first of the battalion posted at the angle of the street. At the moment when they were least expecting it, the captain launched his men against the barricade. This movement, executed with more goodwill than strategy, cost the Fannicot company dear. Before it had traversed 2/3 of the street it was received by a general discharge from the barricade. 4. The most audacious, who were running on in front, were mown down point blank at the very foot of the redoubt. And this courageous throng of National Guards, very brave men but lacking in military tenacity, were forced to fall back, after some hesitation, leaving 15 corpses on the pavement. This momentary hesitation gave the insurgents time to reload their weapons. And a second and very destructive discharge struck the company before it could regain the corner of the street, its shelter. A moment more, and it was caught between two fires, and it received the volley from the battery piece which, not having received the order, had not discontinued its firing. The intrepid and imprudent Fannicot was one of the dead from this grape shot. He was killed by the cannon, that is to say, by order. This attack, which was more furious than serious, irritated Enjolras. "The fools," said he. "They are getting their own men killed and they are using up our ammunition for nothing." Enjolras spoke like the real general of insurrection which he was. Insurrection and repression do not fight with equal weapons. Insurrection, which is speedily exhausted, has only a certain number of shots to fire and a certain number of combatants to expend. An empty cartridge box, a man killed, cannot be replaced. As repression has the army, it does not count its men, and, as it has Vincennes, it does not count its shots. Repression has as many regiments as the barricade has men, and as many arsenals as the barricade has cartridge boxes. Thus they are struggles of 1 against 100, which always end in crushing the barricade. Unless the revolution, uprising suddenly, flings into the balance its flaming archangel's sword. This does happen sometimes. Then everything rises, the pavements begin to seethe, popular redoubts abound. Paris quivers supremely. The quid divinum is given forth. A 10th of August is in the air. A 29th of July is in the air. A wonderful light appears, the yawning maw of force draws back, and the army, that lion, sees before it, erect and tranquil, that prophet, France. Chapter 13. Passing gleams. In the chaos of sentiments and passions which defend a barricade, there is a little of everything. There is bravery, there is youth, honor, enthusiasm, the ideal, conviction, the rage of the gambler, and, above all, intermittences of hope. One of these intermittences, one of these vague quivers of hope suddenly traversed the barricade of the Rue de la Chanvrerie at the moment when it was least expected. "Listen," suddenly cried Enjolras, who was still on the watch, "it seems to me that Paris is waking up. It is certain that, on the morning of the 6th of June, the insurrection broke out afresh for an hour or two, to a certain extent. The obstinacy of the alarm peal of St. Mary reanimated some fancies. Barricades were begun in the Rue du Poirier and the Rue des Gravilliers. In front of the Porte Saint-Martin, a young man, armed with a rifle, attacked alone a squadron of cavalry. In plain sight, on the open boulevard, he placed one knee on the ground, shouldered his weapon, fired, killed the commander of the squadron, and turned away, saying, 'There's another who will do us no more harm.' He was put to the sword. In the Rue Saint-Denis, a woman fired on the National Guard from behind a lowered blind. The slats of the blind could be seen to tremble at every shot. A child 14 years of age was arrested in the Rue de la Cossonnerie, with his pockets full of cartridges. Many posts were attacked. At the entrance to the Rue Bertin-Poiré, a very lively and utterly unexpected fusillade welcomed a regiment of cuirassiers, at whose head marched Marshal General Cavaignac de Baragueux. In the Rue Planche-Mibre, they threw old pieces of pottery and household utensils down on the soldiers from the roofs. A bad sign. And when this matter was reported to Marshal Soult, Napoleon's old lieutenant grew thoughtful, as he recalled Suchet's saying at Saragossa, "We are lost when the old women empty their pots de chambre on our heads." These general symptoms which presented themselves at the moment when it was thought that the uprising had been rendered local. This fever of wrath. These sparks which flew hither and thither above those deep masses of combustibles which are called the faubourgs of Paris, all this, taken together, disturbed the military chiefs. They made haste to stamp out these beginnings of conflagration. They delayed the attack on the barricades Maubuée, de la Chanvrerie and St. Mary until these sparks had been extinguished, in order that they might have to deal with the barricades only and be able to finish them at one blow. Columns were thrown into the streets where there was fermentation, sweeping the large, sounding the small, right and left, now slowly and cautiously, now at full charge. The troops broke in the doors of houses whence shots had been fired. At the same time, manœuvres by the cavalry dispersed the groups on the boulevards. This repression was not effected without some commotion, and without that tumultuous uproar peculiar to collisions between the army and the people. This was what Enjolras had caught in the intervals of the cannonade and the musketry. Moreover, he had seen wounded men passing the end of the street in litters, and he said to Courfeyrac, Those wounded do not come from us. Their hope did not last long. The gleam was quickly eclipsed. In less than half an hour, what was in the air vanished. It was a flash of lightning unaccompanied by thunder. And the insurgents felt that sort of leaden cope, which the indifference of the people casts over obstinate and deserted men, fall over them once more. The general movement, which seemed to have assumed a vague outline, had miscarried. And the attention of the Minister of War and the strategy of the generals could now be concentrated on the 3 or 4 barricades which still remained standing. The sun was mounting above the horizon. An insurgent hailed Enjolras. "We are hungry here. Are we really going to die like this, without anything to eat?" Enjolras, who was still leaning on his elbows at his embrasure, made an affirmative sign with his head, but without taking his eyes from the end of the street.